are when Washington takes office, the problems and solutions that he uses to solve the problems in his presidency, the political parties that develop, foreign affairs, and also Washington's farewell address that ends his presidency. Up until now, we've been studying the Constitution, the development of our government, and the development of a nation. In the Constitution, it states that there will be a president who's head of the executive branch. As part of the development of a new nation, they elected Washington to that post. And in this presentation, we'll discuss how his presidency came to be and also his accomplishments and the things that he did that left precedent or traditions that he left behind for our country. Washington was an admired general in the Revolutionary War and also a big part of the victory at the French and Indian War. So before he was elected to president, he was a well-known leader with our nation. And during the Revolutionary War, we had no one true leader, a government leader, but Washington kind of filled that role as general. So he was a natural fit when he was elected and took office in April of 1789 as the first president of the United States. Washington understood the new nation depended on him and that he would need to set precedents. The Constitution was an outline. It put a working government into place, but it didn't actually specify how presidents make decisions besides the lawmaking process, and also who was going to help them make those decisions. So it was Washington's job to really put a person into that role and put these laws into action, or put the Constitution into action. Washington appointed 4 well-known men to help advise him, and this was known as the cabinet. Now there's a lot more members to the cabinet, but Washington was the first to set this up. The men that he put in his cabinet were Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, and Edmund Randolph. All these men were big players in the Constitutional Convention and the development of the Constitution. You might recognize Thomas Jefferson from writing the Declaration of Independence, and Edmund Randolph actually came up with the Virginia Plan, which led to the Great Compromise and the development of the major principles in the Constitution itself. So he had great men helping him to make big decisions in this new nation. When Washington took presidency, the nation wasn't without problems. One of the major problems was we had an economic crisis. As we know, war oftentimes leads to debt because it costs a lot of money to fight in a war with all of the weaponry, ammunition, and also feeding and housing of soldiers. So this caused an economic crisis in the United States. Alexander Hamilton played a big role in coming up with a solution to the financial problems, but he wasn't without opposition. Hamilton decided that the U.S. would pay all federal and state debts that they had owed without just leaving it to the states or the federal government. They would also create a national bank system for organizing and distributing money, and also impose an import tax or a high tariff. So anything that would be brought into the country would be taxed. So although many people disagreed with taxes, it is important to have money for the government to run on. Jefferson opposed Hamilton, and this will cause a division within the cabinet. Jefferson had a much different view of the Constitution and what it states. And this led to a lot of tension between the two, and it will lead into the development of political parties later on. One of the major problems that developed as a result of the economic crisis was the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1791, there was a tax imposed on all whiskey made and sold in the United States. Whiskey is made from corn product, and a lot of times farmers would create the whiskey as another type of income. So farmers were very upset by this, and they compared it to the acts that the British imposed on the colonists that started the Revolutionary War. So they began to exercise their First Amendment right by protesting, and they refused to pay the tax. This is where Washington came in with a solution. He showed that as the commander-in-chief of this country, he could solve problems that maybe wouldn't have been solved under the Articles of Confederation, like in Shays' Rebellion. So he sent militia, and this showed strength of the federal government. There wasn't really a battle or anything like that, but just the presence of militia there showed that, yes, you can protest and exercise your right, but you can't take things too out of hand to the point where things would get violent or dangerous. And also that you have to listen to the government, and sometimes we have to pay taxes just for the greater good of society. This slide shows how factions was an organized political group where forefathers opposed because it led conflict between cabinet advisors and members. Factions later were known as political parties, and they formed over a disagreement on how the Constitution should be interpreted, loosely or strictly. The graphic below shows how Federalists and Democratic Republicans' views were different, and also shows that there wasn't a clear-cut Democrat and Republican as we have today. The two are completely different. There were political parties that came to be, and the top two were the Republicans and the Federalists. As I mentioned before, don't confuse Republicans in this sense with Republicans of today. Although they share some similar ideals, they're not exactly the same. And Federalists aren't a different name for Democrats. They're two completely different parties at this point in time. So getting back to the facts. Looking at the chart, Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson. He is a prime example of someone who stuck to the Republican beliefs. And his opponent, Alexander Hamilton, was a Federalist. First, let's take a look at the Republicans. Jefferson was on the Republican side, and he believed that people should have political power. He also believed in a strong state government rather than a strong central government. Although he believed that there should be some involvement with a national government, not like under the Articles of Confederation, but that the state government should still stay strong and have influences on decisions that are made for the greater good of the country. He believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, taking each sentence word by word and applying that to what's going on in the country, and that you shouldn't really add anything that isn't in there, like the national bank that Alexander Hamilton suggested. At this point in time in the world, there was a lot going on in Europe, and part of that was the French Revolution and their ideas. And Thomas Jefferson agreed with those ideas, and he would consider himself pro-French along with the rest of the Republicans. He opposed a national bank because it was outside the powers of Congress as listed in the Constitution to come up with a national bank. And he also opposed a protective tariff, or to raise high taxes on imported items. The main Federalist example at this point in time was Alexander Hamilton, and he opposed Thomas Jefferson on many ideas. He believed that the wealthy and educated should lead the country, that not everybody was entitled to an opinion or a vote, which may sound harsh, but he felt like if you're going to make decisions for the entire country that you should probably have an education, and at this point in time, the only people that could afford education were the wealthy. He believed in a strong central government. Although there still should be states governments, he felt the central government should be making most of the changes and the decisions. He emphasized manufacturing, shipping, and trade. This guy was an economist. He believed in the best ways for making money in the most efficient ways possible, and so he really focused on manufacturing, shipping, and trade, and how to use those sources to bring money in for the betterment of the government. He believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, that you shouldn't take everything word for word, and that as time changes, so do the rules. So he also believed, if there isn't something that's explicitly stated in the Constitution, then we can do it. The Federalists were pro-British. At this point in time, the British opposed the French in Europe, so you start to see a split on who should take sides, and the Federalists sided with the British. They also favored the development of a national bank and a protective tariff in order to better the economy at this point in time. As I mentioned before, it's important to know how the United States was involved with foreign affairs, and in Europe there were a lot of things that involved the U.S. to some extent. One of those was the French Revolution, which started in 1789, and we've mentioned this before. The French Revolution was kind of kicked off as a result of the American Revolution because the people in France saw that the people can indeed rise up and overthrow the government if it's corrupt. However, in the French Revolution, they had a strong monarchy of a few people with a lot of wealth making a lot of poor decisions for people that didn't have a lot of wealth. So you see the poorer classes and the middle classes rising up to overthrow the rich, wealthy monarchy. So the United States at this time favored the revolutionary ideals that the French had. They thought, they had the same things that they want the same things that we wanted, and we should really get behind them on this effort because they helped us win that war. However, when the revolution turned unnecessarily violent, they started to denounce or disapprove of the French Revolution. And that type of unnecessary violence was called the Reign of Terror, where they would just execute people that disagreed with the revolutionary ideals or were accused of disagreeing with them. So the United States did not want to stand behind that. And because they didn't, it caused a lot of conflict with France, because France was saying, hey, we helped you guys out, we helped you win that war, and now you're not going to support us. So it caused a lot of tension. France and Britain were also at war with each other, and Washington thought it would be the best decision to remain neutral rather than trying to side with one or the other. Since the country was so new and they were just getting out of war debt, they didn't want to start another war and get into further debt. But this decision did anger the French. Just like I said before, they expected us to help them because they helped us when we needed it. Although that sounds a little unfair because we didn't help them when we needed it, historians believe that Washington made a good decision by trying to stay neutral and stay out of the rest of the world's business as long as we're not directly involved. And this set precedent or tradition for further presidencies' foreign affair policies. Also, the relations with the British were sour at the beginning, as you can imagine. So, as a result of the Treaty of Paris, the British were supposed to get out of our country, and they didn't. And then on top of that, we weren't supposed to be getting involved in the war between the British and the French, but they were still practicing impressment of our soldiers or taking over their ships and imprisoning our soldiers. So as you can imagine, we're a little bit upset by this. So a man named John Jay goes to Great Britain and sets up a treaty in 1795. And in this treaty, the United States paid the debts that they owed to Britain, but in turn, the British paid for the ships that they took, and they also leave the Northwest Territory. As part of the Treaty of Paris, they were supposed to leave, and they never did. But after the treaty that John Jay negotiated, they were able to leave. This is also considered a big win in Washington's presidency and one of his great ideas and solutions. Although it wasn't explicitly stated in the Constitution yet, Washington would end his presidency and not seek a third term. So it did say in the Constitution at this point in time that the president would serve 4-year terms, so 4 years at a time. He served 2, but did not go after the third. And this set precedent, and I keep using that word, it basically means tradition, for a 2-term presidency, which until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that's pretty much what presidents did, even though there was no set rule for it. So he ended his presidency and retired from public life in 1796 and published a letter to his fellow Americans. In Washington's farewell address, he leaves a message for Americans on what they should do in the raising of this young nation. He warned against political divisions, basically political parties. He felt like that these divisions would be unproductive in making decisions. And it's kind of funny when you think about political parties today. In the last election, there was a lot of controversy on decisions just aren't getting made because people can't get along. And that's what Washington was warning against. He also told the United States that they should not entangle with foreign affairs. if we don't have something at stake for our country, then we shouldn't get involved.